He walked into the Ashford Grand with a 7-year-old boy on one side and a battered red toolbox on the other. And the woman at the front desk looked at him the way people sometimes do when they're trying to decide if someone belongs somewhere. He didn't look like he belonged. He knew that. His jacket was clean, but it was the kind of clean that comes from washing something too many times. And his hands, no matter how hard he scrubbed, still held the ghost of engine grease in the creases of his knuckles. 38 years old. Widower. Owner and sole employee of Keene's Auto and Restoration. Population, 1 mechanic, 1 boy, 1 memory he carried everywhere like a tool he didn't know how to put down. His name was Daniel Keene, and he had not planned on being here. The call had come in at 4:15 on a Thursday afternoon, just as he was finishing a brake job on Meredith Howell's Subaru, and his son, Finn, was in the corner of the garage doing his homework on the workbench the way he always did after school. Pencil in one hand, granola bar in the other, asking questions about fractions that Daniel answered between torque wrench clicks. The number was a Toronto area code. Daniel almost didn't pick up. He got calls sometimes from suppliers, from parts wholesalers, from a cousin he hadn't spoken to in 3 years. He almost didn't pick up. "Mr. Keene," the voice said. It was a woman, composed and precise, the way voices sound when they belong to someone who answers to someone important. "My name is Sylvia. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Ashford. We understand you recently completed a full restoration on a 1969 Maserati Ghibli S for a client in Collingwood. Is that correct?" Daniel wiped his hands on a shop rag and said yes, that was correct. "Mr. Ashford has a situation," Sylvia said, "that requires someone of your particular background. He's prepared to compensate generously for your time and discretion. He would need you tonight." Daniel looked at Finn. Finn looked back at him over the top of his math worksheet. 7 years old, same serious eyes his mother had, same way of going very still when something important was being decided. "Tonight," Daniel repeated. "Tonight," she confirmed. He said he'd call back in 10 minutes. He hung up. He looked at his son for a long moment, and then he looked at the Subaru, and then back at his son. "What did she want?" Finn asked. "A job. Are we going?" Daniel hadn't said we. He noticed that Finn had. "Maybe," he said. Finn closed his math worksheet with the quiet certainty of a boy who already knew the answer. The Ashford Grand sat about 40 minutes outside of Toronto, along a stretch of road where the trees were old and thick, and the properties didn't have signs, because the people who lived there didn't need to announce themselves. It wasn't a hotel. The name was just what everyone in the region called the estate, a habit that had started sometime in the 70s and stuck the way habits do when no one challenges them. The main house was Georgian white stone, the kind of architecture that says money not as a boast, but as a simple statement of fact. There were outbuildings, a carriage house that had been converted into a 12-bay garage, manicured laneways, lights that came on automatically as you drove in, calm and unhurried, like the estate itself was deciding whether to acknowledge you. Daniel had heard of Warren Ashford the way you hear of weather, something large and distant that affects everyone around it. He ran Ashford Capital. He was 61 years old and had been profiled in every major publication at least twice. He collected things, companies, properties, and, as it turned out, cars, significant cars. Cars that other men passed over because they were complicated, or because the parts were impossible, or because the engineers who built them were long dead. Warren Ashford collected exactly those. The garage alone would have stopped Daniel's heart if he'd had time to stand still in it. He didn't. Sylvia, a small, precise woman in a gray blazer, met him at the entrance and moved him through it at a pace that suggested the cars were incidental. He counted a Bugatti Type 35 under glass, a Ferrari 250 GT Lusso, something he thought might be an Alfa Romeo 33 Stradale, but couldn't confirm because Sylvia was already talking. "Mr. Ashford's concern this evening is the Bizzarini 5300 GT, she said. "It arrived from Italy 6 months ago. The restoration was handled by a firm in Zurich, one of the most highly regarded in Europe. The car was completely rebuilt. New wiring harness, rebuilt carburetors, full mechanical overhaul. It passed every diagnostic they ran. It was shipped here in a climate-controlled container. It has not run since. Not once," Daniel said. "Not once." He looked at the car. It sat at the far end of the garage under soft overhead lighting, long and low and amber, the kind of shape that in the 1960s made grown men stop walking. The Bizzarini 5300 GT was one of the most beautiful things Giotto Bizzarini had ever designed, and he had designed things that made other engineers feel like they were working in the wrong field. 400 and some horsepower from a Chevrolet Corvette small block. Independent suspension all around. A car that could do 0 to 60 in under 6 seconds in 1965, which was the kind of fact that sounded impossible until you saw the engine bay. The Zurich firm sent someone, Sylvia continued. He was here for 3 days, and he flew home, he told Mr. Ashford the problem was likely a fault in the electrical system introduced during shipping, and that he would need to return with specialized equipment from Zurich. That was 11 days ago. The automotive division of a Toronto dealership also sent 2 senior technicians. She paused, just briefly. They came to the same conclusion as the man from Zurich. Daniel crouched down beside the car without touching it. Finn stood a few feet behind him, holding the red toolbox with both hands, watching. "What kind of specialized equipment?" Daniel asked. Sylvia said, "That was the question, mister." Ashford asked as well. From somewhere behind him, a door opened. Daniel stood up. Warren Ashford was taller than his photographs suggested. He wore dark trousers and a pale blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, which was either casual or calculated. Daniel suspected it was both. He had the handshake of a man who'd learned early that handshakes matter and had never stopped practicing. His eyes moved from Daniel to Finn and back, and something in his expression shifted, though it wasn't what Daniel expected. It wasn't the careful professional neutrality of a man pretending a child's presence didn't complicate things. It was something quieter, a flicker of something old. "Mr. Keene," he said, "thank you for coming on short notice." He looked down at Finn. "And you must be the assistant." Finn considered this with the gravity of a professional being welcomed to a new job site. "I'm Finn," he said. "I help with the kit." He meant the toolbox. He'd called it the kit since he was 4, which was the year Daniel had given him his own small set of tools with handles sized for small hands, and the year Finn had started using the word like it was technical terminology. He was not wrong. It was technical terminology. Daniel had just never corrected him. Warren Ashford nodded seriously. "The kit," he said. "Good, we'll need it." The garage cleared out. The 2 remaining technicians from the Toronto dealership, who had still been on site, ostensibly for a second opinion, gathered their things with the particular quiet of professionals who understand when they've been replaced. One of them, a younger man with the build of someone who'd spent real time under real cars, paused near the door and gave Daniel a look that wasn't hostile. It was closer to exhausted. It said, "Good luck." It said, "I mean that sincerely." Daniel pulled a stool up beside the car and sat for a moment before opening anything. This was the part of the job that nobody photographed. The sitting, the looking, the particular quality of attention you had to learn over years of working on machines that people had given up on, the patience of someone who understood that a car was, at its core, a system of intentions. Somebody built it. Somebody made a decision about every part of it. If it didn't run, there was a reason, and the reason was always logical, even when it was buried. Finn sat on a camping stool 2 meters away, doing his homework. He'd pulled it from the small backpack he'd brought without being asked, along with a juice box and 2 granola bars, one of which he placed quietly on the toolbox for his father without comment. Warren Ashford stood near the entrance to the garage. He had, against what Daniel suspected were his instincts, agreed to stay back and not speak. Sylvia had translated this agreement into a look that said, "He is trying." Daniel opened the hood. He'd worked on Bizzarini's before. Twice, once in his previous life, when he was a senior engineer with a classic vehicle restoration firm in Hamilton, the kind of position that came with a salary and benefits and the particular confidence of someone who's been told they're valuable. Before Christine. Before the accident on the 400 that February 3 years ago. Before the company laid off half its technical staff 8 months later, and Daniel, who by then had Finn in school and a garage on a residential street in Barrie, and a grief that made every morning feel like walking through water, had decided to stop commuting to Hamilton and just work. Just work. Make the garage pay. Fix what people brought him. Take the complicated jobs that other shops turned away, because they didn't have the patience or the background. He'd kept Christine's photograph on the workbench. Finn had asked once why it was there, and Daniel had said, "Because I like to see her while I work." And Finn had thought about this for a while, and then gone back to his homework, and neither of them had mentioned it again. He started at the beginning. Fuel delivery first. He ran the system pressure, listened to the pump. Everything within spec. He pulled the carburetors, a set of 4 Webers, rebuilt in Zurich, pristine, and inspected the jets. Clean. Correct sizing. He reinstalled them. He moved to ignition. The distributor was new. The points were gapped correctly. The cap was dry and unmarked. He checked the rotor. He followed the high-tension leads from the cap to each plug, pressed each one firmly, listened for any sound that didn't belong. Finn asked, without looking up from his worksheet, "Is it the thing behind the thing?" Daniel paused. "What?" "When the car in the drawer wouldn't start," Finn said. He meant the 1/18 scale model Pontiac GTO he'd been given last Christmas, which had developed an electrical fault in its miniature battery compartment. "You said it was the thing behind the thing. The connection behind the connection." Daniel looked at his son. 7 years old, the quiet inheritance of 100 evenings in the garage. "Maybe," Daniel said. He moved to the wiring harness. The harness had been replaced entirely by the Zurich firm. Daniel ran his hands along it, slowly, methodically, the way you do when you're not looking for anything specific yet. The Zurich work was impeccable. Every connection properly insulated, every ground located where the schematic said it should be. He traced the circuit from the battery terminal through the ignition switch, through the ballast resistor. He stopped. The ballast resistor. He looked at it for a long time. Then he got up and went to his toolbox and pulled out his multimeter. The resistor was new, brand new, installed by the Zurich firm as part of the complete overhaul. And it was new, and it was correct for the application. Except, and this was the thing, the Bizzarini 5300 GT was one of the last cars built before the widespread adoption of the ballast resistor as a standard ignition component, and the original factory specification called for a full voltage feed at the coil. The Zurich firm, working from a generalized restoration protocol rather than a model-specific one, had installed the resistor as a matter of standard practice, which reduced the coil's primary voltage by approximately half, which meant the coil was producing a spark, technically, correctly, that was nonetheless too weak to ignite the fuel-air mixture reliably at the compression ratio this engine was built around. The car was producing fire, just not enough fire. It was the thing behind the thing. Daniel sat back on his heels and looked at the engine for a moment. He glanced at Finn, who was still doing his worksheet, and felt something move through him that he hadn't been able to name for a while. Something that was adjacent to pride, but wasn't exactly pride. It was more specific. It was the feeling of a man who has carried something heavy for a long time, and suddenly, for one moment, sets it down without meaning to. He turned to where Warren Ashford was standing. "I need to bypass the ballast resistor," he said. "I need a short length of wire rated for this gauge, a couple of connectors, and 20 minutes. Warren Ashford was quiet for a moment. "That's it? That's it." Another silence. Sylvia was told the issue required specialized equipment from Zurich. The issue required someone to read the original factory schematic instead of the generic restoration protocol. Daniel paused. And a wire. He had the wire. He had it in the toolbox. In a small roll of various gauges he carried the way a carpenter carries spare screws. Not because you plan to need them, but because you've learned what happens when you don't have them. Vince had fallen asleep by the time Daniel was ready to test. He'd pushed the camping stool against the side wall, curled up on it with his jacket folded under his head, one hand resting on the corner of the red toolbox, the way he sometimes held Daniel's arm when they were walking. Daniel stood for a moment just looking at him before he turned the key. The Bizzarini 5300 GT started on the first try. The sound it made was something between a conversation and an argument. That particular small-block Chevrolet voice in an Italian skin, deeper and rougher and more alive than the garage had any right to contain. It settled into an idle that was steady and low and absolutely correct. And Daniel held still for a moment with his hand on the quarter panel, feeling the vibration through his palm. Warren Ashford stood at the front of the car. He was looking at the engine bay, but Daniel had the impression he wasn't seeing the engine. He was seeing something else, something specific to him, something that had nothing to do with the car. 40 years ago, Ashford said, not quite to Daniel. My father drove one of these. He sold it when I was 9. He needed the money. He paused. I've spent 20 years trying to find one in equivalent condition. This one came up in Milan. I paid more for it than I should have. He stopped. He seemed to realize he'd said more than he'd intended. He looked up. What he would have thought, Ashford said, of a Zurich firm. He said it quietly, and there was something in it that wasn't quite amusement. Daniel didn't say anything. There wasn't anything that needed to be said. Sylvia came with an envelope. Daniel had been paid well before, in the Hamilton years, in the years when his credentials were current and his life was organized around salary reviews and project milestones. This was different. This was the kind of payment that comes from someone who understands what they were actually paying for. Not the wire, not the 20 minutes, but the 47 combined years of someone's father standing in garages and the 12 years Daniel himself had spent learning to see what other people didn't. He thanked her. He said it simply, without performance. Then he went to wake up Finn. Finn came awake the way he always did, immediately, fully, without the transitional fog that most children have. He sat up on the camping stool and looked around and then looked at his father and said, "Did it work?" "It worked." "It worked." Finn nodded, as though this confirmed something he'd already decided. He reached for the granola bar wrapper on the floor. He never left garbage, and tucked it into his jacket pocket and stood up and picked up the red toolbox with both hands. Warren Ashford was still in the garage. He walked over and crouched down to Finn's level, which was something Daniel noticed because a lot of adults didn't do it, or did it in that effortful way that makes a child feel like a subject rather than a person. "The kit," Ashford said, nodding at the toolbox. "Does it have everything you need?" Finn thought about this seriously. "Most things," he said. "We don't have a thing for the big bolts yet. Dad says maybe for my birthday. What's the word for the big bolts?" "Torque wrench." "Right." Ashford stood up. He looked at Daniel. "He's been paying attention." "He pays attention to everything," Daniel said. It was the most accurate thing he'd said all evening. They drove back to Barrie in the dark, the highway opening up wide past the edge of the city, the kind of late-night driving that has its own specific texture, the emptiness of it, the headlights finding only what's directly ahead. Finn was asleep in the passenger seat by the time they hit Highway 400, his head's against the window, the seatbelt across his small chest. The red toolbox was on the back seat. Daniel drove with one hand on the wheel, and the radio low and the heater running, because it had turned cold the way October does in Ontario. Suddenly and without discussion, as if it had somewhere to be. He thought about Christine. He thought about her the way he always did on drives. Not in the sharp, terrible way of the first year, but in the way of someone handling something that had slowly, very slowly, become possible to hold. He thought about the way she used to leave coffee on the workbench in a thermos without saying anything. Just appearing and disappearing, which was the way she moved through the world. He thought about how Finn had her eyes and her stillness and the particular way she had of being certain about things without making a production of it. He thought about what it meant to fix the thing nobody else could fix. Not for the feeling of it, he didn't need that, but because it was what he knew how to do, and knowing how to do something and doing it was the least complicated form of integrity he'd found. The garage in Barrie was dark when they got home. He carried Finn in from the car, still light enough to carry, just barely, which wouldn't last much longer, and he knew it, and brought him up to bed and tucked him in and stood in the doorway for a moment, the way parents do when everything is quiet and the child is asleep and the day has settled. He went back down to the garage. He didn't turn on the main lights, just the workbench lamp, which cast the familiar yellow circle over the surface, where Christine's photo sat in its frame next to his coffee mug and a stack of service manuals. He sat down. He didn't do anything for a while. He just sat. The red toolbox was on the bench beside him. He'd set it there without thinking about it, the way you set down something that belongs exactly where it is. Outside, the October wind came through the seam at the bottom of the garage door, and the building settled slightly with the cold the way old buildings do, and from upstairs there was no sound at all, because Finn was asleep. Properly asleep. The way children sleep when they've been somewhere and done something and come home to a place that is theirs. Daniel looked at Christine's photograph. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He turned off the lamp and went to bed.